Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. And having shared a video on the economic consequences of the Wall Street crash, this is my complementary video on the social consequences. Now this is a part of a famous song written in 1932 by Gorney and Harburg, and originally called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? I was tempted to sing it to you, but thought better of it. The song depicts how men who had contributed to America's economic well-being and who had fought for their country were now left begging on the streets for small change. It's a powerful source. And as I said in the other video, unemployment was the most visible result of the Great Depression. And such was the depth of the Great Depression that unemployment was in nearly every case long-term. And it affected so many. Out of a population of some 120 million people, it has been estimated that 40 million people were either left unemployed themselves or were affected by a family member being unemployed. And if we also think that some 30 million people earned a living in some capacity through farming, which was desperately struggling, we see that the scale of the problem was truly staggering. Men tramped the streets in search of work, but they had little chance of finding any. And with no savings to fall back on, and most likely at least some debt, the consumer boom had been aided by people buying goods on hire purchase, and houses and farms had been bought with mortgages. Unemployment meant goods had to be returned. It meant mortgage foreclosures, or else that rent couldn't be paid, and that would lead to evictions. Families that had been living comfortable lives plummeted into real poverty. And these were ordinary people. Remember, history is always about people. Helpless victims of a force they had no control over, the Great Depression. Now there was also a racial dimension. Not only was a much higher percentage of African Americans left unemployed, they would be the first to be fired, but African American workers were fired so that white people, who wouldn't have otherwise have taken such jobs as waiters, hotel workers and elevator operators, could now do so. And I come clean to say that the image I use in this slide is not strictly a Great Depression image, though the photograph was taken in 1937, and it is so powerfully symbolic. It was the same for women too. Their jobs would go first in order to save a man's job. For example, throughout the 1930s, more than 3/4 of school boards refused to employ wives as teachers, whilst the civil service only allowed one member of a family to work for them, and it was usually the wife who gave way. The plight of the unemployed was made worse by the fact that America had no welfare system, no unemployment benefit to support them. Cities and towns ran relief programs, but the scale of the problem was such that the relief programs couldn't help everyone, and as the numbers of unemployed grew, so local taxes shrunk, and many of the programs were actually cut back. Charities and wealthy individuals also tried to help with soup kitchens and cheap meal centres. But again, such voluntary help was faced with a problem on such a massive scale that it struggled to cope. Most of those who lost their homes were taken in by relatives. Humiliating, uncomfortable, but at least they weren't homeless. Many were, though, homeless and destitute. Many were even forced to live in homemade shelters, using scrap wood, corrugated iron, even cardboard boxes. They didn't survive a rainfall, or else they pitched tents. These camps were built in city parks, or else on city outskirts. They quickly became known as Hoovervilles, after the president. They of course had no running water or sewage systems. Others simply slept in the open. The blankets they slept in, discarded newspapers wrapped around them in an attempt to keep warm, became known as Hoover blankets. Some would deliberately get arrested in order to spend the night in jail, where they would even be fed. Others opted out altogether and committed suicide. Many suffered from malnutrition and starvation, with some admitted to hospital. In New York, 1/5 of children were undernourished, and the proportion was higher in industrial cities and mining areas. People were dying of starvation and exposure. In cities, desperate people went to rubbish dumps to see what food they could scavenge. There was also stealing, with some families sending their children out to steal food. It was a really desperate time. Families were split up as men set off around the country to look for work. It is estimated some 2 million men took to travelling from city to city on freight trains in a constant search for work. Thousands of children took to the freight trains too. Now it is true that the Great Depression cut through all classes, from the wealthiest through the middle classes to the working class and down to the already poor. But even so, at its worst point, with 1 in 4 workers unemployed, there were still 3 out of every 4 in work. And though many were on reduced hours or else reduced wages, and though they will have feared being the next victim, they nevertheless, at the height of the Great Depression, were still in work. So clearly, not everyone was affected in the same way and to the same degree. So, I hope this is a useful sketch for you of how the Great Depression affected people. It must have truly been an awful time, with people feeling both helpless and without hope. Not a good place to be. You know where you can find more detail, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But I will thank you for listening, as I hope I always do. Cheers.